In July 1939, a routine police arrest in Glasgow's Gorbals district exploded into one of the most violent riots the city had ever seen. 2 gang members were being taken into custody. Nothing unusual. Glasgow police arrested gang members every single day. But these weren't just any gang members. They were Beehive Boys. Within minutes, hundreds of people flooded into the streets. Not to protest, not to watch, to fight. Shop windows were smashed. Police reinforcements arriving in squad cars were pelted with stones and bottles. Officers were forced to form protective lines to prevent mass looting. The riot spread across multiple streets, consuming entire neighborhoods in violence. And the Beehive Boys weren't fighting alone. They had called in their allies, the Southside Stickers, another razor gang that controlled territory just blocks away. Together, they transformed a simple arrest into a declaration of war against Glasgow's police. This was the power of the Beehive Boys, not just another street gang, not just another group of unemployed young men fighting over territory. The Beehive Boys were something different, an organized criminal network that combined territorial violence with sophisticated theft operations, that recruited across sectarian lines in a city torn apart by religious hatred, and that built a reputation so fearsome that even future boxing champions couldn't stand out among their fighters. But the Beehive Boys didn't operate in isolation. Glasgow in the 1920s and 1930s was a war zone. Over 100 razor gangs divided the city into territories marked by blood and violence. The Billy Boys, 800 strong, Protestant, fascist, controlled Bridgeton. The Norman Conks, Catholic, brutal, held the streets south of Bridgeton Cross, and dozens of other gangs fought for control of neighborhoods across Glasgow's East End and Southside. Among these gangs, the Beehive Boys stood out. They weren't just street fighters. They were thieves, fraudsters, and racketeers. They carried out smash-and-grab raids on shops. They ran protection rackets. They had connections to criminal networks in England. And they viewed other Glasgow gangs, even the infamous Billy Boys, with contempt, seeing them as mere brawlers, while the Beehives considered themselves criminal professionals. And then there were the Redskins, a gang so violent, so chaotic, so dangerous that even in a city full of razor gangs, they stood out as exceptional. The Redskins weren't from one neighborhood. They were a collection of choice spirits drawn from the wilder limits of Glasgow, who gravitated to Bridgeton as their headquarters. Their acts of violence were described as reading like a nightmare. This is the story of the Beehive Boys and the Redskins, 2 gangs that represented different models of Glasgow gang culture. One organized and criminal, the other chaotic and purely violent. Both armed with razors. Both willing to fight police, rival gangs, and anyone who crossed them. This is also the story of how Glasgow's gang culture evolved from the sectarian warfare of the Billy Boys and Norman Conks into something more complex and more dangerous. A story about poverty, unemployment, and young men with no future except violence. And ultimately, a story about how one man, Chief Constable Percy Sillitoe, would use unprecedented police tactics to destroy Glasgow's gang culture and arrest thousands of gang members in a campaign that would change British policing forever. Glasgow in the 1920s was suffering. The shipyards that had once employed tens of thousands of men were in decline. The heavy industries that had made Glasgow one of the wealthiest cities in the British Empire were closing. Unemployment in working-class neighborhoods reached 30, 40, even 50%. Young men who should have been working in factories or building ships had nothing. No jobs, no money, no prospects. And in neighborhoods like the Gorbals, Bridgeton, Calton, and Parkhead, these young men formed gangs. By 1930, over 100 gangs operated in Glasgow. Some were small, 20 or 30 members controlling a few streets. Others were massive. The Billy Boys, at their peak, numbered 800 members divided into sections of 40, each with its own leader. These gangs were territorial. They claimed specific neighborhoods, specific streets, even specific street corners as their territory, and they defended that territory with razors. The straight razor, the kind used for shaving, became the weapon of choice. It was cheap, it was easy to conceal, and it was devastating when used in close combat. A slash across the face could leave permanent scars. A cut across the throat could kill. The gangs developed a signature attack called the Glasgow Smile, or Chelsea Grin, cutting from the corners of a victim's mouth towards their ears, creating a grotesque permanent scar that marked them as someone who had crossed a Glasgow gang. But the gangs weren't just about violence. They were also about identity. In a city with massive unemployment and grinding poverty, gang membership gave young men something: belonging, purpose, a sense of power in a world that had given them nothing. Many gangs were purely territorial. The Southside stickers took their name from their location. The Calton entry controlled the Calton district. These gangs fought over neighborhood boundaries, over perceived slights, over nothing at all. But some gangs added another layer: sectarianism. Glasgow was, and in many ways still is, divided along religious lines. Protestant and Catholic communities lived in different neighborhoods, attended different schools, supported different football teams, Rangers for Protestants, Celtic for Catholics, and often viewed each other with suspicion and hatred. The Billy Boys were the most notorious sectarian gang. Founded and led by Billy Fullerton, a member of the British Fascists and later the British Union of Fascists, the Billy Boys were aggressively Protestant. They marched in Orange Order parades, celebrating Protestant victories over Catholics. They sang sectarian songs. They wore similar clothing to create a unified, militaristic appearance. And they fought the Norman Conks, their Catholic rivals, in battles that could involve hundreds of fighters. On Orange Walk days, Protestant celebrations of the 1690 Battle of the Boyne, the violence would escalate dramatically. The Billy Boys would march through Glasgow, singing sectarian songs and waving banners. Catholic gangs like the Norman Conks would gather to confront them, and the resulting battles would turn entire neighborhoods into war zones. But not all gangs were sectarian. And this is where the Beehive Boys become interesting. The Beehive Boys took their name from a draper's shop, a clothing store, located at the corner of Thistle Street and Cumberland Street in the Gorbals, one of Glasgow's toughest Southside neighborhoods. The gang emerged in the late 1920s and reached its peak in the 1930s. Unlike many Glasgow gangs that were purely focused on street violence, the Beehive Boys combined territorial control with organized criminal enterprise. The core membership of the Beehive Boys was small, perhaps a dozen to 20 central figures, but their influence extended much wider. According to police records from the 1930s, the Beehives were viewed as the major organized gang of thieves in Glasgow. The gang's leadership included several notable figures. Peter Williamson was identified by police as a central member. He had connections to criminal networks beyond Glasgow, including contacts in England. Williamson and his associates were involved in sophisticated theft operations, not just street violence. Herbert Howie was another key figure. Interestingly, Howie wasn't from Glasgow. He was a native of Belfast, Northern Ireland. His presence in the gang suggests that the Beehives recruited talent from beyond Glasgow's boundaries. Dan Cronin was identified as one of the gang's central figures, and, like Williamson, was Catholic. But here's what made the Beehive Boys unusual. While the core leadership was predominantly Catholic, the gang also recruited Protestant youths from the Gorbals. In a city where sectarian gangs like the Billy Boys and Norman Conks defined much of the gang landscape, the Beehive Boys operated differently. They prioritized neighborhood loyalty over religious identity. If you were from the Gorbals, if you were tough, and if you could contribute to the gang's criminal operations, your religion didn't matter. This doesn't mean the Beehive Boys ignored sectarianism entirely. Protestant members of the gang were active supporters of Rangers Football Club, the symbol of Protestant identity in Glasgow, and presumably participated in Orange Walk celebrations. But within the gang itself, sectarian divisions were subordinate to criminal business and territorial control. What truly set the Beehive Boys apart was their criminal sophistication. While gangs like the Billy Boys were primarily focused on street violence and territorial dominance, the Beehive Boys viewed themselves as professional criminals. They carried out smash-and-grab raids, attacking shops by smashing windows, grabbing valuable goods, and escaping before police could respond. These raids required planning, coordination, and speed. They were involved in fraud operations. Some gang members specialized in different types of crime: theft, fraud, protection rackets. This specialization suggests a level of organization uncommon among Glasgow's street gangs. They had connections to criminal networks in England. Several Beehive Boys traveled to other British cities to carry out crimes, suggesting they operated beyond Glasgow's boundaries. Chief Constable Percy Sillitoe, who would later lead the campaign to destroy Glasgow's gangs, described the Beehive Boys as representing a formidable threat. He noted that the gang was composed of a core of experienced criminals who had links with the criminal underworld in England, and a wider group of street fighters of such force that even a future boxing champion did not stand out among them. That last detail is remarkable. One Beehive Boy, named Murphy, would later become a professional boxer. Sillitoe claimed that Murphy possessed no great standing among the Beehives because he wasn't exceptional compared to the gang's other fighters. If a future boxing champion couldn't stand out among the Beehive Boys' street fighters, imagine how dangerous the rest of them were. The Beehive Boys also controlled territory in the Gorbals with an iron grip. The Gorbals was one of Glasgow's poorest and most dangerous neighborhoods. Tenement buildings packed with families living in poverty. Streets where unemployment was the norm. And in this environment, the Beehive Boys ruled. They collected protection money from local businesses. They controlled illegal gambling operations. They settled disputes, violently, within their territory. And they defended their neighborhood against rival gangs from other districts. But the Beehive Boys didn't fight alone. When necessary, they formed alliances with other Southside gangs, like the Southside Stickers. The 1939 riot that opened this documentary, when hundreds of people fought police to prevent two Beehive Boys from being arrested, demonstrated the gang's ability to mobilize massive numbers quickly. This combination of criminal sophistication and street violence made the Beehive Boys one of Glasgow's most dangerous gangs. They weren't just brawlers. They were organized criminals who used violence strategically and who viewed other gangs, even the notorious Billy Boys, as mere amateurs focused on pointless territorial violence. While the Beehive Boys represented organized criminal enterprise, the Redskins represented pure chaos. The Redskins emerged during the period between World War I and World War II, likely in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Unlike most Glasgow gangs, which were rooted in specific neighborhoods, the Redskins were described as a collection of choice spirits drawn from the wilder limits of Glasgow, who gravitated to Bridgeton as their headquarters. This is significant. The Redskins weren't a neighborhood gang. They were a gang of Glasgow's most violent individuals who chose to gather in Bridgeton, the heart of Billy Boys' territory, as their base of operations. Historical records describe the Redskins' acts as reading like a nightmare. This is extraordinary language. Glasgow in the 1930s was full of razor gangs committing brutal violence. For contemporaries to single out the Redskins as uniquely horrifying suggests they operated at a level of violence that shocked even a city accustomed to gang warfare. Unfortunately, detailed records of the Redskins' specific crimes are scarce, but we can piece together what made them so notorious. They weren't bound by territorial rules. Most Glasgow gangs stayed in their neighborhoods and defended their territory. The Redskins, as outsiders who gathered in Bridgeton, didn't have a natural territory to defend. This made them unpredictable. They could show up anywhere, attack anyone, and disappear. They likely engaged in extreme violence. For a gang to be described as nightmare-inducing in 1930s, Glasgow required going beyond the already brutal norm of razor slashings and street brawls. The Redskins probably committed acts of violence, torture, mutilation, public terror that went beyond what even other razor gangs considered acceptable. They operated during wartime chaos. The description of the Redskins specifically notes they emerged with its many phenomena during the war period. World War I and the lead-up to World War II created social chaos in Glasgow. Thousands of men were away fighting. Economic conditions worsened. Social controls weakened. In this environment, the Redskins flourished. Bridgeton got the blame. The historical account notes that Bridgeton got the blame of this gang, but those who knew them knew that they were a collection of choice spirits drawn from the wilder limits of Glasgow. This suggests the Redskins' violence was so extreme that it damaged Bridgeton's reputation, even though Bridgeton was already infamous as the headquarters of the Billy Boys, Scotland's largest and most violent gang. The relationship between the Redskins and the Billy Boys is unclear. Did the Billy Boys tolerate the Redskins operating in their territory? Did they collaborate, or were they rivals? Historical records don't provide clear answers. It's possible the Redskins operated as a kind of mercenary gang, fighters for hire who could be brought in for particularly brutal jobs. Or they may have been a splinter group that broke away from established gangs like the Billy Boys, taking the most violent members and operating independently. What's certain is that the Redskins represented a different model of gang organization than the Beehive Boys. Where the Beehives were organized criminals using violence strategically, the Redskins were pure violence specialists. They didn't seem interested in protection rackets or theft operations. They were interested in terror. By the early 1930s, Glasgow's gang problem had become a national scandal. Newspaper reports of razor slashings, street battles, and gang violence were appearing not just in Glasgow papers, but across Britain. Glasgow was being portrayed as Britain's most violent city, a place where law and order had completely broken down. The response came in 1931, when Glasgow's authorities appointed a new chief constable, Percy Joseph Sillitoe. Sillitoe had built his reputation fighting gangs in Sheffield, England. He understood that traditional policing methods, waiting for crimes to be reported, investigating after the fact, didn't work against organized gangs. He needed a new approach. Sillitoe's strategy was revolutionary for British policing. He would target the gangs proactively, use overwhelming force, and send a message that gang membership itself was no longer tolerable. First, Sillitoe recruited differently. Instead of hiring local Glasgow men who might have sympathies with gang members or connections to their families, Sillitoe recruited from rural areas and the Scottish Highlands. He wanted big, strong men who had no ties to Glasgow's gangs and wouldn't be intimidated by their reputations. Second, Sillitoe trained his officers to fight. Glasgow's gang members were experienced street fighters who knew how to use razors, bottles, and their fists. Sillitoe trained his police officers in hand-to-hand combat so they could physically dominate gang members in confrontations. Third, Sillitoe changed police tactics. Instead of uniformed officers walking beats predictably, Sillitoe deployed plainclothes officers who would infiltrate gang territories, gather intelligence, and strike when gangs gathered. Fourth, Sillitoe targeted gang leaders personally. He understood that arresting random gang members wouldn't destroy the gangs. He needed to arrest the leaders, men like Peter Williamson of the Beehive Boys and Billy Fullerton of the Billy Boys, and prosecute them aggressively. Fifth, Sillitoe used overwhelming force. When police confronted gangs, they didn't come alone. They came in large numbers, with vehicles and reinforcements ready. The message was clear. If you fight police, you will lose. The results were dramatic. By the mid-1930s, gang numbers were declining. Between 1931 and 1935, thousands of gang members were arrested. Many were convicted of assault, weapon possession, and breach of the peace. Some received prison sentences. Others were sent to borstals, reform schools for young offenders. The Beehive Boys were a particular target. In one famous case, 13 Beehive Boys were arrested and prosecuted together. The trial exposed the gang's structure, its criminal operations, and its members' backgrounds. 7 of the 13 arrested bore visible marks of street fighting, scars from razor slashes, broken noses, damaged hands. The prosecution portrayed the Beehive Boys as Glasgow's most dangerous organized criminal gang. The defense argued they were simply young men from poor neighborhoods trying to survive. The jury convicted them. Billy Fullerton and the Billy Boys also faced intense police pressure. Fullerton was arrested multiple times. The Billy Boys' public marches were disrupted by police. Their gatherings were raided. By the late 1930s, the Billy Boys, once 800 strong, were in serious decline. But Sillitoe's campaign wasn't without controversy. Critics argued that police were using excessive force, that they were targeting working-class young men while ignoring organized crime among Glasgow's wealthy, that the campaign was more about social control than genuine crime reduction. There was also the question of why gang violence had erupted in the first place. The gangs weren't criminals by nature. They were young men without jobs, without education, without opportunities. Arresting them didn't solve the underlying problem of poverty and unemployment. Nevertheless, by the late 1930s, Glasgow's gang problem was diminishing. Not solved, gangs would continue to exist in Glasgow for decades, but reduced from the epidemic levels of the late 1920s. And then World War II began. Thousands of young Glasgow men, including many gang members, enlisted or were conscripted into military service. The social and economic conditions that had created the gang explosion changed, and Glasgow's razor gang era came to an end. The Beehive Boys and the Redskins represent two different models of Glasgow gang culture that would influence organized crime in Scotland for decades to come. The Beehive Boys showed that gangs could be more than just street fighters. They could be organized criminal enterprises that combined violence with sophisticated theft, fraud, and racketeering. This model would evolve in later decades into the drug-dealing criminal organizations that would dominate Glasgow's underworld in the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond. The Redskins, meanwhile, represented pure violence for its own sake. Gangs that existed not to make money or control territory, but to inflict terror. This model, too, would persist, in the form of youth gangs that fought over reputation and status rather than criminal profit. But both gangs also represent a specific moment in Glasgow's history, a moment when poverty, unemployment, and sectarianism combined to create conditions for mass gang membership. A moment when over 100 gangs divided the city into warring territories. A moment when young men with no future turned to violence as their only source of power and identity. That moment passed. Economic conditions improved after World War II. Employment increased. The worst slums were cleared and replaced with new housing. And Percy Sillitoe's aggressive policing had demonstrated that gangs could be suppressed through overwhelming force. But Glasgow never fully escaped its gang culture. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond, gangs continued to exist. They evolved, from razor gangs to football casual firms to drug-dealing operations. But the fundamental dynamic remained: young men from poor neighborhoods organizing into violent groups. Some former Beehive Boys went on to careers in organized crime. The skills they developed, theft, fraud, connections to criminal networks, transferred easily to the post-war criminal underworld. Others left crime entirely. Some found legitimate employment. Some emigrated. Some simply aged out of gang life and settled into working-class respectability. The Redskins, being less organized and more chaotic, probably dispersed more completely. Without the criminal sophistication of the Beehive Boys, individual Redskins likely either died young, went to prison, or simply faded away. Despite the historical records we have about the Beehive Boys and Redskins, many questions remain unanswered. Who were the Redskins' leaders? Unlike the Beehive Boys, whose core members are documented in police files and court records, the Redskins remain largely anonymous. We know they existed. We know they were terrifyingly violent. But we don't know who led them or what specific crimes they committed. What was the relationship between the Redskins and the Billy Boys? Did Billy Fullerton tolerate the Redskins operating in Bridgeton? Did they collaborate? Were they rivals? The historical record is silent. How did the Beehive Boys view the Redskins? The Beehive Boys reportedly looked down on purely violent gangs as unsophisticated. Did they view the Redskins as useful allies or as dangerous amateurs? Did they ever fight each other? What happened to individual gang members? We know some were arrested and imprisoned, but what about the hundreds of others? Did they simply age out of gang life, find legitimate employment, move into other criminal activities? How much of No Mean City is true? H. Kingsley Long's 1935 novel, No Mean City, is a fictionalized account of Glasgow's razor gangs. It's widely considered sensationalized, but it was written during the razor gang era, suggesting the author had some first-hand knowledge. How much of the novel reflects reality? The Beehive Boys and the Redskins are largely forgotten today. When people think of Glasgow's gang history, they think of the Billy Boys and Norman Conks, the sectarian giants whose battles defined 1930s Glasgow. But the Beehive Boys and Redskins were just as important. They represented different models of gang organization that would shape Glasgow's underworld for generations. The Beehive Boys showed that gangs could be criminal enterprises, not just street fighters. Their combination of violence and criminal sophistication would become the template for later Glasgow crime families. The Redskins showed that pure violence, unconstrained by territory or rules, could terrorize an entire city. Both gangs emerged from poverty, unemployment, and a city that had failed its young men. Both were suppressed by aggressive policing, and both left legacies that echo in Glasgow's criminal history to this day. This is their story. The story of Glasgow's forgotten razor armies.